I woke up at 6:47 a.m. to the smell of coffee my husband never makes for me anymore. That should have been my first warning. What I didn't know was that 11 hours earlier, while I was asleep, he had signed a document that quietly erased my name from everything my late father had left me. No shouting. No argument. Just a pen, a notary, and a man who thought silence was the same as consent. He thought I'd never find out. He had no idea that 3 days later, his own lawyer would be the one to call him and destroy him. CTA. Before I tell you how this unfolded, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe if you believe silence is never the same as surrender. Part 1. The signature. My name is Melissa Grant. I'm 34, a hospital administrator. Married 9 years to a man named Derek, who used to open doors for me, and now barely looks up from his phone. 3 months before that morning, my father died. He left me the one thing Derek had wanted his entire marriage. A 40% stake in Grant and Holloway Logistics, a mid-sized freight company my father built from a single truck in 1991. Derek had worked there for 6 years as operations manager, always one title away from the top, always reminding me how much more he deserved. I didn't think about the will as leverage. I thought about it as grief. I buried my father on a Tuesday and went back to work on a Thursday, because Derek said sitting around wouldn't bring him back. That should have told me something. What I didn't know was that Derek had been meeting privately with my father's business partner, Richard Holloway, for weeks. Richard had never liked that my father left controlling influence to me instead of consolidating it under someone who actually runs the business. His words, according to what I'd later learn. The night before that fateful morning, Derek came home late, kissed my forehead, and told me he loved me. I remember thinking it felt different. Warmer than usual. I didn't know it was the warmth of a man who thought he'd already won. While I slept, Derek used a durable power of attorney, one I had signed 2 years earlier during a minor surgery, just in case, never once imagining he'd use it while I was healthy and simply asleep, to authorize the transfer of my inheritance shares into a newly formed holding company. One he and Richard controlled 60-40. By morning, on paper, I owned nothing. But here's what Derek didn't know. My father hadn't trusted Richard for years. And 3 months before he died, weak but sharp-minded, my father had done something Derek never found out about, something buried in a filing cabinet at a law office Derek had never heard of. I didn't find out about the transfer that morning through some dramatic confrontation. I found out because I logged into the shareholder portal to check quarterly numbers, out of habit, and saw an ownership restructure notice dated the night before. My hands went cold. I read it 4 times before it made sense. Derek walked into the kitchen holding his coffee, smiling like a man who'd just made the smartest move of his life. "You're up early," he said. I looked at him and said nothing. Not yet, because the woman he married that morning wasn't the same one he'd go home to that night. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I opened my laptop, and I started making calls, not to a divorce lawyer. Not yet. To someone else entirely. Someone whose name Derek had never once heard my father mention. That call would take 3 days to matter. But when it did, it would ring on Derek's phone from his own attorney. 3 days. That's how long I let Derek believe he'd won. I spent that time doing what I do best at the hospital, staying calm under pressure, while everything around me demanded panic. Derek noticed I wasn't fighting him. He mistook it for defeat. "I figured you'd understand eventually," he said on day 2, pouring wine like we were celebrating something. "It's better this way. The company needs one clear voice at the top." Richard agrees. I smiled and said, "I'm sure he does." What Derek didn't know was that on day 1, I had called a number I found in my father's private address book, a name I'd never paid attention to before. Arthur Feld, an estate attorney in a small office 2 towns over. Not the family lawyer Derek had met a dozen times at holidays. Arthur didn't sound surprised when I called. He sounded like he'd been waiting. "Your father came to me 4 months ago," he told me. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, "If anything ever happens to my shares without Melissa's knowledge, I need there to be a wall nobody can climb over." My father had done something Derek never imagined a sentimental old man capable of. He'd placed my inheritance shares into an irrevocable trust with a poison pill clause. Any transfer of those shares without my personal, notarized, in-person consent, not a power of attorney, not a proxy, nothing signed while I was unconscious or unaware, would automatically trigger a full forensic audit and revert ownership back to the trust, with the offending party personally liable for damages and legal fees. Derek's power of attorney covered medical and minor financial decisions. It said nothing about estate shares held in trust. Richard's lawyers, the ones who'd helped Derek draft the transfer, had never checked. Overconfidence made them sloppy. Arthur didn't need me to do anything except sign one form authorizing him to formally notify the company's board and Derek's own corporate counsel of the trust violation. That's the part Derek never saw coming. He assumed I'd fight him directly, an angry wife, a messy divorce, a private war he could control. He never imagined I'd let his own attorney be the one to deliver the news. On the morning of day 3, Derek's phone rang at 9:12 a.m. I was in the kitchen when he answered it, and I watched his face change in real-time confusion. Then disbelief. Then something close to fear. "What do you mean the transfer's void?" he said. "What do you mean I'm personally liable?" His lawyer's voice was loud enough that I caught pieces of it through the phone. "Unauthorized use of power of attorney. Trust violation. Board has already been notified. Richard Holloway is requesting to know who authorized this." Derek looked at me like I'd betrayed him. I almost laughed. He'd used a legal shortcut while I was asleep and thought silence meant he'd gotten away with it. "You knew," he said, hanging up. "You knew this whole time, and you let you show me exactly who you are," I said. "That's all I did." Richard, sensing blood in the water and unwilling to be dragged into a liability mess of Derek's making, distanced himself within 48 hours. Quietly informing the board he'd had no knowledge of the trust's restrictions, which was, conveniently, mostly true. Derek was left alone holding a legal violation with his name on every document. The board froze the disputed shares pending the forensic audit Arthur had triggered. Derek was suspended from his operations role 3 weeks later, pending review. After the audit revealed he'd also quietly redirected 2 vendor contracts to a shell company, Richard partially owned something nobody had been looking for, until the trust violation forced the books open. I filed for divorce the same week. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Derek tried, once, to explain himself standing in the driveway as movers loaded his belongings, telling me he'd only done it because he'd earned a place at the top after 6 years of being overlooked. I didn't argue with him. I didn't need to. "You didn't get overlooked," I said. "You got trusted. And you used a woman's exhaustion and grief to take something that was never yours to take. My father saw that in you before I did. I kept my shares. I kept the house my father had helped us buy." Derek kept a legal violation on record, a suspended position, and a reputation in the logistics industry that would follow him to every interview he'd ever sit through again. 6 months later, I sat on the board of Grant & Holloway Logistics, not as a symbolic widow's seat, but as the majority voice my father had quietly protected for me before he ever knew he was dying. I never raised my voice once through any of it. I never needed to. For the first time in my marriage, silence wasn't something Derek used against me. It was something I used against him, and he never saw it coming until it was already over.